All right, so we begin today, and I would ask you to take out your Bibles, please, and we're going to be in the book of Daniel today. We're going to be looking specifically at a few verses in Daniel 3, but in order to do that, we will do a little bit of a skim from Daniel 1 to Daniel 5. I know that seems like an awful lot, but it's not going to be really. It's just going to be focus on some material that's important leading up to Daniel 3, and then some stuff that follows Daniel 3 as far as the folks that we're going to be looking at today. And I'm excited to share this with you. I hope that you will be blessed by our time together. But I want to start, I was just thinking about this during the week. I just want to start by asking how you're doing. How are you? You know, we're in the midst of something that none of us has ever experienced before, and and I know that that can take a toll on us physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I know that about a week ago, uh, I realized for the first time in several weeks that I did not feel like I was walking around in a fog. Um, I was just at work, and I realized that I had more motivation, I had more energy, I had more desire to get things done, and I didn't even know. I didn't even know that I was in a daze. I didn't even know that any of this had been affecting me until all of a sudden I realized that day it wasn't. And so I've been thinking about you, and I've been wanting to reach out and just say, how are you doing? I hope that you're well. My heart goes out to you, and I'm worried about all of us. And I'm not worried about getting sick. Like I said several weeks ago when we started this, I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about even if God calls me to die during this time. I don't worry about that. What I worry about is things like you worrying about, are you gonna have enough food? You worrying about, is the money going to be there to pay the bills? I know several people, or at least a few people personally, who have small businesses that are being hurt right now. And so I'm asking from the depth of my heart, how are you doing? And I hope that you will take some time to let me know. If you watch this video, and I know some will, some won't, um, leave me a comment on the Facebook page, or send me a private message on Facebook, or text me, or something. Let me know that you're doing okay. In times of national and international distress, our personal lives can be disrupted, and all that's familiar to us can just kind of be out of whack, and it feels like things may never be normal again. And so today, I just again want to ask that question: how are you doing? And more specifically, I want to ask the question: is it well with your soul? In the midst of all that's going on, are you maintaining your faith and your hope and your confidence in God? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just pray that you'll watch over our study today as we get into your word, Lord. I pray that you will challenge us with the notion that you are God, and that you will remind us that we can trust in you no matter come what may. It just doesn't matter, Lord, what comes into our lives, that if we put our confidence and our faith and our trust in you, that we will be okay. It can be well with our souls. And I pray, Lord, that that will come through in this look at your wonderful book of Daniel. Help us, Lord, to pick up the message that is here and apply it to our lives in Jesus' name. Amen. I want to read with you Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshack, Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship the golden image that you have set up. I love these guys. I love these three men, Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. You know that they were the young men brought into captivity into the Babylonian Empire after the fall of the kingdom of Judah, where they lived, and the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And here they are in the midst of a situation in Babylon where they are having to stand before that very king and defend their actions, and they had to defend their faith. And I was wondering if they might feel kind of like the person who wrote this psalm, Psalm 37, written about the Jews being in Babylonian captivity. The writer says in Psalm 137, and I want you to picture this. I want you to think about this song that someone was singing. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. And there are a couple other verses here, but just in those few verses, we see the emotions and the depth of anxiety and anxiousness. Anxiety and anxiousness are the same thing, and anguish and longing for home. And they said, how can we sing one of the songs from Jerusalem? How can we sing one of our worship songs here in this foreign land when they've destroyed our temple, when they've destroyed our nation, when they've carried away the articles out of the temple and they put them into the midst of the temples for their gods? How can we sing songs like that? And here we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3 in an audience with the king. And we're going to get into their response in just a minute, but just by way of introduction, they said, "King, we're not even in a position to have to answer your question because we know that God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, it doesn't matter because we're still not going to bow down to the image that you've created." But who was this Nebuchadnezzar that we read about in Daniel chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4? Nebuchadnezzar, or in some versions, some places in the Bible, maybe some of the translations, it's Nebuchadrezzar. The N is switched out for an R, and I guess that makes a change in the meaning of the name. And there are some thought that Nebuchadnezzar with an N is actually kind of a mock of Nebuchadnezzar and a taunt to him in the Aramaic language, but I don't know that for sure. But Nebuchadnezzar is a name that occurs about 90 times in Scripture. This isn't a Jew, this is a Babylonian king, and he's mentioned at least 90 times. So he's an important guy. He was a son of a guy named Nabopolassar who led a revolt against uh, the Assyrian Empire and created this thing called the Chaldean Kingdom, the Chaldean Empire, or as we know it, the Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar, who was a son of this guy, came to the throne of Babylon when he was about 40 years of age, and he reigned for about 43 years, and he died in 561 BC, so about 561 years before Jesus was born. And he was a haughty and proud tyrant in Babylon, and he was presumptuous and bold in the way he offended God. He was kind of like the way Pharaoh was back in the book of Exodus when Moses said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh kept challenging God. Who's this God that you're talking about? Why should I listen to him? It's the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar does. He's got that same kind of arrogance, that same kind of pride, that same kind of boldness and taunting God. And someone has written, without doubt, Nebuchadnezzar was a most illustrious monarch, a prudent, brave, and daring war leader who by his own personal exploits added to the extensive dominion he had inherited from his father. And that's found in the book All the Kings of the Bible by Herbert Lockyer. And so he just says, look, this guy was brave, he was smart, he was this courageous leader, valiant in war, and he took the kingdom that his father had given him and expanded that kingdom, kind of like Solomon did with the kingdom that David gave to him. Solomon enhanced that kingdom and grew that kingdom. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar does. He was the one who brought the kingdom of Judah to an end and led the nation into a state of Babylonian captivity. And this magnificence and splendor of this king and his court um, was just as equal to his power and his cruelty. So, in other words, just as he was cruel and he's powerful, but at the same time, his court, the way he ran his kingdom, was just magnificent and gorgeous. They talk about the one of the seven wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I was reading that it is thought, I don't know if it's been proven, but it's thought that Nebuchadnezzar had that built for one of his wives because she was from another part of Persia or from Persia, and he was trying to recreate for her some of the beauty from her home area. And so there's this beautiful place that he created, the grandeur of Babylon's buildings and temples and the royal palaces and gardens. It was just the admiration of the world at that time. We even see that in Isaiah 43 verse 19. Isaiah 13 verse 19. Excuse me. I meant to have that marked, but I didn't. So let me just turn over there real quick. It just talks about the splendor of this Babylonian empire. Isaiah 13 verse 19 says, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms." Now this is God talking here. And God says, Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. He says, Babylon, you're incredible. You're amazing. You're so beautiful and has so much splendor. And there's nothing like you. He says, but when I'm through with you, you're going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah. And you remember that story. Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by God because of their sinfulness of those people that lived there. And so the prophet Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel teach us that Nebuchadnezzar was a mighty tyrant. But although he was a mighty tyrant, he was used as an instrument in God's hands, a servant through whom God is going to accomplish his purposes. And God does that, doesn't he? He raises up kings, he raises up nations in order to bring judgment against another nation, against another people. If you even think about the book of Jonah, why did Jonah run away when God told him to go to Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria? Because he didn't want God to bless those people. He didn't want God to allow them to repent. Because Assyria was just this amazingly cruel kingdom. And God had used that kingdom that was so cruel to bring Israel into judgment. So that's what God kind of does. And God determined to punish the offenses of his people by their insolence and oppression of this Chaldean ruler. And he allowed Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar to go on and to prosper, even though he was wicked and pompous and haughty and taunted God. God still used him. We see in 2 Kings 24:2 and Jeremiah 25 verses 8 through 12 and Jeremiah 27 and verse 6 in Jeremiah chapter 44 and verse 30. And all of those areas, God says that He's going to use Nebuchadnezzar as an instrument of His. He's going to be a servant of God. Kind of an interesting way that God works in His sovereignty. The Babylonian kings laid siege to Jerusalem twice, once in 597 and once again 10 years later, 587 BC. And we see that in 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25. If you go back and read 2 Kings 24 and 25, you'll see what Nebuchadnezzar did to Judah. You'll see what he did to Jerusalem. You'll see how he led the king away, how he led nobles and royal people away, how he destroyed Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon, and all of that. The book of Jeremiah calls Nebuchadnezzar the destroyer of nations, Jeremiah 4 and verse 7, and gives the account of a second siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC and the looting and the destruction of Solomon's temple. We see that in Jeremiah chapter 39, verses 1 through 10, and Jeremiah 52, verses 1 through 30. So Nebuchadnezzar's a pretty important guy in the biblical narrative. And he even assaulted Egypt for 4 months before the fall of Jerusalem in 587. And he's represented in Ezekiel as a divine initiative undertaken by the destruction of Jerusalem is represented in Ezekiel as a divine initiative undertaken by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So even in Ezekiel, Ezekiel says, look, when God destroyed Jerusalem by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, um, he was using Nebuchadnezzar as an instrument. So that's who this king was. He's the greatest king in the East. He's the greatest king in Babylon's history. And this is the king before whom Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego are standing in Daniel chapter 3. Well, who are these three guys? We'll go back over Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to find out a little bit about them. They were part of Judean royalty, or at least the nobility. In Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3, when Nebuchadnezzar has done what he's done in Jerusalem in the third year of his reign, Daniel chapter 1 verse 1, we'll go down to chapter 3, and it says, Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. So he says to this guy, he says, I want you to bring back some of the royals and some of the nobles. But he goes on in verse 4 and he says, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So we take those couple of verses together. What we can say is Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego were either royal descendants, or they were at least of the nobility. And not only that, but they were young, and they were good looking, and they were smart, they could be taught, and they were competent in order to be able to stand in front of the king as advisors. And in chapters 1 and verses 5 through 7, it said the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of all the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. And among those were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So here are these three guys plus Daniel, the guy who wrote this book. And they are this royal, noble class, young guys, good-looking guys, smart guys, and they've been chosen to be a part of this group of young men that were to be trained. And at the end of 3 years, they were go through this rigorous training. At the end of 3 years, they're supposed to come before the king and be tested. And that actually did happen. And in chapter 1, starting in verse 17, as for these 4 youths, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So in addition to all these other things, Daniel understood how to interpret visions and dreams and things like that. And that's important because it comes up. At the end of the time, the end of that 3 years, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus of the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. So this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We kind of got a picture of who they are. We got a picture of who Nebuchadnezzar is. But now we're going to go back to Daniel chapter 3. Well, actually, before we hit Daniel chapter 3, we're going to take a brief tour through chapter 2 because we need to understand some background here, a little bit more background into Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream in Daniel chapter 2. We're not going to go through the dream. It's outside the scope of this lesson. But in this dream, he sees this image, this golden image. I mean, this image has like a gold head and different body parts. And the interpretation of this dream, Daniel comes in and he interprets this dream. And he basically says, Nebuchadnezzar, look, this statue, this image represents 4 kingdoms. You are the head of gold. You are Babylon. You are the great king. You are the great nation. But after you is going to come another kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's going to be inferior to yours. And then after that one, there's going to come a third kingdom. And it's going to be even it's going to be even more inferior. Sorry, my tongue's a little bit tied today, apparently. It's going to be this Greek empire. It's not going to be as strong as the Medo-Persian Empire. It's not going to become anywhere close to being as strong and powerful as Babylon. And then the Roman Empire. These 4 empires, Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman Empire. And so what's happening here is God is telling this Nebuchadnezzar, this great king, this most important king in Babylonian history, this king with this impressive empire. He says to this king, Nebuchadnezzar, in a dream, your kingdom is going to fall. And it's going to be followed up by lesser kingdoms. And they're all going to be controlled by the providence of God to bring about his future purposes. Because we find out that in Daniel 2, the image, the part of the image that talks about that Roman Empire, in that part of the dream, we find the kingdom of God being established and it being something that encompasses all the other kingdoms. And then we find in Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 through 47, that Nebuchadnezzar humbled himself and he makes a preliminary acknowledgement of God. In Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 through 47, he says, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face after he'd heard this dream. He knew the dream, but after he heard the interpretation of this dream, he falls on his face and he pays homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. So he begins to acknowledge God here. He says, your God is God of gods. He's the king of lords, or the Lord of kings, the Lord of kings. And he's beginning to acknowledge who God is here, but he's not there. How do I know he's not there? Because of what he's about to do in chapter 3 and what he's going to do in chapter 4. He is not there yet, but he's beginning to do that. And it says in verses 48 and 49 that Daniel was promoted, kind of like Joseph was back in Egypt when he successfully interpreted Pharaoh's dream. Daniel is promoted in verses 48 and 49. He was given high honors and great gifts. He was made ruler over the province of Babylon. And he was made the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So there was all the wise men, and there was Daniel in charge of all those guys. He was so wise. Nebuchadnezzar just kind of put him in charge of all the wisdom of Babylon. But Daniel didn't forget his 3 friends. And at his request, it says in verse 48 and 49, at his request, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So Daniel's in charge of the whole thing, but underneath Daniel, he's got his 3 friends kind of running the province. And then we come to Daniel chapter 3, which is kind of where we started all of this. And in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar makes this huge golden statue. The English Standard Version says that it was 60 cubits high, and a cubit's about 18 inches. I didn't do the math on that, so go figure out the math. Let me know how tall this image was. It was a big statue. And he required that the people show their obeisance to him by bowing down before the statue. He says, look, um, he tells all these leaders, all these satraps and prefects and governors and counselors and the treasurers and the justices and the magistrates and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that he'd set up. And he tells them to come. And then he goes into this whole big thing. And he says to them, verses 3 through 8, he says, look, when you hear all this music that's being going to take place, all these different instruments, when all that begins to happen, then what you need to do is you need to fall down, you need to worship this image. And if you don't, I'm going to have you thrown immediately into a fire or furnace. You're going to be destroyed. So all these guys are from all over the kingdom of Babylon are there in the capital city where this image is, and they're standing there. And verse 7 of Daniel chapter 3, therefore, as soon as the peoples heard the sounds of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So when they heard all that musical stuff, they just immediately dropped and start worshiping this image. But then we find that there's a problem in verses 4 through 12. In verse 4, therefore at that time, what time? At the time when all these leaders of the province of Babylon, when they're all supposed to be bowing down and worshiping this image, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. Now, who were the Chaldeans again? Now, the Chaldeans as a people were the Babylonians, but there was a group within that were those prefects. They were those wise men. Remember the guys that Daniel was put in charge of? And the guys that Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego are responsible for? These Chaldeans come in to make a malicious charge against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they said to the king, King, didn't you say that all the people were supposed to bow down and worship this image when they heard the music? Well, there are these three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who don't pay attention to you. They're ignoring you, King. See, they're playing up to his pride. They're coming to him and they're playing to his pride and his pompousness and his idea that he's so important. And they said, look, you're the greatest king ever. And these three guys are not paying attention to you. And the king is not happy. But here's the thing. Why would Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bow down to this image? Because they remembered that one of the main reasons that this judgment had come upon the people of Israel, I mean, people of Judah, is because they had fallen into the practice of idolatry. They were sitting in Babylon for the very fact and the very reason that the people of their country worshiped images and participated in idolatry, which is against the first and second commandments. And they said, we're not doing that anymore. We're not, and they may never have done it, but the people of Israel had done it. The people of Judah had done it. And they said, we're not going to do that. Even though they're in exile and they're surrounded by this culture that doesn't share their faith, this culture that says we're not going to do anything to go against the king. In the midst of all that, these three men do not compromise their faith. And they do not allow the king of Babylon to cause them to worship this image against the command of God and the covenant of God. There's a message for us here. The message for us is that we need to be loyal and devoted to the living God, no matter what, no matter what happens, we are to be devoted to God. So these guys come in and they make these accusations. Well, what's going on with them? These Babylonians, they're obviously just jealous that Nebuchadnezzar has promoted these foreigners, these Jews, over them to positions of esteem and positions of authority, positions of honor. And these four guys are kind of close to the king. And they don't like it. They're jealous of. We see that again in Daniel chapter 6 in the Persian Empire with Daniel in the lion's den and all that. The same thing happens. Daniel continues to get promoted even in the second kingdom. And the other wise men come and they say to the king there, Daniel doesn't obey you, God or a king. You said that no one's supposed to pray to anybody but you for 30 days. He's over there praying to his God. And there's an issue there. But in verse 15, Daniel chapter 3, verse 15, we see what Nebuchadnezzar, he's actually really, really mad here. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 13, I think I said 15, but it should be 13. The Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. So you remember what the initial thing was? If you don't bow down and worship the image, you're going to be immediately thrown into the fiery furnace. Well, he didn't do that. The king didn't even obey his own command here because he said, "You talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Bring him here. Let me talk to these guys. They're my guys." He's mad. He's furious. He's angry. But he holds back from throwing them into the furnace. And he has them brought in. And then he says in verse 14, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" Is it true? I'm hearing that you're not paying attention to what I said. Is that true? Surely not. And he says, now if you're ready, maybe you weren't ready before. Now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. He says, look, guys, I'm going to give you a second chance. When you hear the music, if you just fall down and worship the image, I'll forget everything. I'll go against what I decreed. I'll just act like nothing happened. Everything will be good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hand? He says, I'm giving you a second chance to listen to me, folks. Listen to me, guys. If you don't bow down and worship this image, it is not going to be good. And let me tell you something. I challenge you to find a God strong enough to protect you from me. You hear his arrogance? You hear the haughtiness of this guy? 2 chapters later, his kingdom is gone. Daniel chapter 5. But here we are in Daniel chapter 3. And he says, what God can save you from me? Now we're going to go back to the verses that we started with, verses 16 through 18. Love these verses. Love these men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king. Now listen, we've already established these three guys are Jewish exiles. They're captives. They've been brought into the king's service. They're servants of the king. They're important in the kingdom, but they're still slaves. They're still servants. Standing before the greatest king on earth. And he's challenged them. He's challenged their God. And they say to him, verse 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. They said, look, You want to know what God is able to deliver us from you? We don't even need to respond to that. We don't need to defend our God. We don't need to try to make a case for our God. Do what you want to do. We don't need to answer you in this. They have so much faith in who God is and what God has done. They've seen God working. They've seen God keep his promise. They've seen God bring his judgment against his people as he had said he was going to do. They know that God is capable. So they say, we don't even need to answer you. But they do answer him. Because then they go on, they say, if this be so, if what be so? If you throw us into the fiery furnace. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver. You want to know what God can deliver us? Our God can. He is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. This is a straight up rebellious answer to the great king, the one who's called King of Kings, Nebuchadnezzar. And they say to him, you are nothing compared to our God. We don't have to answer you, but we're going to answer you. Our God is able to deliver us. Our God is able to deliver us out of the fiery furnace. Our God is able to deliver us out of your hand, king. But they don't stop there. I wish I could see Nebuchadnezzar's face right here. I wish I could see his response when he hears these words and just how flabbergasted he must have been and astonished that they dared speak to the great king like this. But they're not done. Verse 18. But if not, but if not what? But if not, if he does not deliver us, our God can deliver us, our God will deliver us, but even if he does not deliver us, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Even if God chooses to allow us to die in this fiery furnace, we're not going to obey you and go against our God, go against his commandment, go against his covenant, and defy who he is just to appease you. We're not going to do it. Kill us. We don't care. Folks, that's the faith that we need to have. Remember, a couple of years ago, all these Christians were being beheaded over in Iraq and places like that. They were showing this on Facebook and things where they show Christians and things being their heads cut off. Yeah, I watched some of it because I wanted to know. The faith of these four men, these three men here, I'll count Daniel, even though he's not in the story. Daniel's the same kind of a guy. These four men is the faith that would say, go ahead and cut our heads off. Go ahead and walk into our churches and shoot us dead. Go ahead and threaten to imprison us for preaching the truth. Doesn't matter because God's able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, he's still God, and we're not gonna go against who he is in order to appease you. Love it. It's like they're saying we're not fair weather fans of God. And we're prepared to lay down our lives to be faithful. Nebuchadnezzar, you thought he was mad earlier? He takes his furious anger that we had in verse 13. He's furious, in furious rage here. It gets blown up even more. Down here in verses 19 through 23. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. You know what that tells me? That tells you that what I was saying a while ago is true. That he's trying to get them to change their mind. He's trying to protect them. Even though he's angry, he's trying to save them. But now his face has changed for them. Now he's not showing them this honor. Now he's not showing them this respect. Now he's just so filled with anger. He doesn't even care who these guys anymore. How dare you talk to me like this? How dare you challenge me as King of Kings? And he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times more than it usually was heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. So he says, that fiery furnace is not even good enough for you people. Make it 7. I don't know how you make it 7 times hotter, but you make it 7 times hotter. And then he has some of the mighty men of his army, not just some guards. See, these are mighty men. And he says, you bind those guys up and you toss them into the fire. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was so hot. And the king was so insistent that this be done right now. Now, these guys get close enough to shove Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, but they are burned up and they die. That's how bad this is. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall bound into the furnace of the fire there. But then, verse 24, Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. And he rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, didn't we cast 3 men into the fire? And they said the king, true, O king. Yeah, we just threw 3 men in there. Yes, absolutely. And the king said, but I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. My mighty men who just tossed them into the fire are laying over there dead. But those 3 guys and somebody else are just walking around in the fire like there's nothing going on. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. I think, and others think this is true as well, that this 4th person may have actually been Christ, come before his incarnation in a physical sense, but he was present with them in the fire. He was present with them in the crucible of flames, and he walked with them there, and he rescued them from the wrath of the king. There are things in the Old Testament. There's things called theophanies where it looks like God has come in the flesh. There are several examples of that, but this looks like what's called a Christophany, which is this person wasn't there in the flesh, but it was like the spirit of whoever this was there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then verses 26 through 30, something really amazing happens. Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Now, a while ago, he says, who's the God who can deliver you? And now he sees them walking around, and he says, you serve the Most High God. Come out of there. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads were not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and they didn't even smell like fire. There was absolutely zero evidence on these men that they'd been cast into the fiery furnace. That's how much our God delivered them out of the hand of this king and out of the fiery furnace. They said, He is able to deliver us out of the fiery furnace. He is able to deliver us out of your hand. But even if he doesn't, and here, not only has he done that, but there is absolutely zero evidence that these three men had come even anywhere near this fire. And then in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Nebuchadnezzar says, These guys disrespected me. They set aside my command. They ignored me to serve this God who has just delivered them. And he said, Blessed be that God. But then it goes on. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. What was his question earlier? What God is there who can rescue you, who can save you from what I'm about to do to you? And in the end, he said there is no God that can do this except for the God that these guys serve. So if anybody in this kingdom ever says another negative thing about their God, I'll destroy them. Now he's not converted yet. He isn't a follower of God yet, but he's at least listening, isn't he? He's at least listening. So when we take Daniel chapter 3 in context of chapters 1 through 5, and these first four chapters have to do with Nebuchadnezzar and when he's king over the kingdom. And chapter 5 has to do with Belshazzar, who follows him. And Belshazzar was the king when the Babylonian Empire fell to the Medo-Persian Empire. When we take all five of these chapters together, we see that God is in control and that he uses men and nations to bring about his will and his plan. And he shows that these chapters show that God is the most powerful God. God is the most high king who rules over the world. It's God, nobody else. And then in chapter 4, just real quickly, just by way of bringing these things to a close here, in chapter 4, there's a judgment that's brought on Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he in chapter 2, he started acknowledging who God was. In chapter 3, he said, There's no other God like this God. No one's to speak against this God. But in chapter 4, he's still kind of being haughty and kind of full of himself. And he had another dream that Daniel had to interpret for him. And basically, the dream we see in chapter 4, verses 24 and 25. Daniel says basically to the king, God's going to humble you for a period of time until you acknowledge who he is. Daniel chapter 4, verses 24 and 25. He says, oops. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had called God the Most High God, hadn't he? He says it's a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you till you know that the Most High rules of the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. 7 periods of time is for 7 years. So this, he says, King, you're going to be humbled for 7 years until you finally acknowledge that God is God. Basically, this is a contest between two kings. There's a king on earth who thinks he's the king of kings, and there's a king in heaven who is the king of kings. And God says, look, I'm going to show you. I'm going to prove to you that I am who I say I am. I am the king of kings. And he says basically, in essence, we will see who has the power. The Most High rules, and he's going to give that rule to whoever he wills, whoever he chooses. 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar, verses 28 through 30, Nebuchadnezzar is boasting about what all he had done. He says, um, at the end of verse 29, at the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? Daniel had said in this about the interpretation of this dream, God is the one who puts people on the thrones of the earth. God is the one who raises kings up. And now Nebuchadnezzar's here. He says, See what I've done by my might, by my power. And while the words were still in his mouth, the dream came true, and he was humbled, and he went about like this animal for 7 years. But I want you to see how the story ends. Verses 34 and 35. Daniel praised God when he came to his senses. At the end of the days, at the end of that period of time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. Look, I said I was this King of Kings, and look at what I've done, and all that. Now this is the King. He's the real King. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, What have you done? There is not a single person on earth can look to God and can say, What are you doing, God? Where are you? What are you up to? Why aren't you doing something else? Why aren't you intervening here? He says nobody can say that to God because he's God. But he's not done. He continues in the next couple of verses. This acknowledgement of who God is. Verses 36 and 37. At that time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. He says, I thought I was great before. But when I was restored to my kingdom, I was increased in my greatness. Why? What changed? It was no longer about what he had done, but it was about what God had done. God put him on the throne initially. God removed him from the throne and humbled him. And then God put him back on the throne and increased him. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. You know what I was thinking when I was studying this? I hope that I get to meet Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. I hope he's there. I hope that this was his conversion. I hope that his acknowledgement of God means that he served God the rest of his life. I don't know if he did, but I hope it's true. But then in chapter 5, just real quickly, chapter 5, this Belshazzar is like the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's the most well, he still thinks that Babylon is this impregnable kingdom. It will just never fall. And the city was the most impregnable city of its time. The walls were so thick and so high that it just wasn't vulnerable at any point. And while he was so arrogant, he had heard that the Persian army had actually entered into his kingdom. He was so arrogant and so full of pride and haughtiness about Babylon and the greatness of his own city that as he knew the Persian army was marching toward Babylon, he threw a feast. This is what the secular historians tell us, that he threw this feast. And it didn't even bother him because he didn't believe that they could do anything to his kingdom. And not only that, they had enough provisions inside this massive city to last for years. He didn't care what they did. He didn't care what the Persians did. And not only was that the case, he said, "Bring me the glasses from the temple of the Israelite God." and they filled those glasses with the choice wines of Babylon, and they raised them to toast the gods of Babylon. And then he sees something that no one else sees, or at least he can see something on a wall that they didn't see yet. And he goes and gets that interpreted by Daniel, and basically Daniel says, kingdom's over, and you're going to die. Secondly, historians say that there was an underground stream that went under the wall of Babylon that supplied water to the city. So the Persian commander dammed up the water, and when it all stopped flowing, there was this viaduct that became visible under the wall of Babylon, and the Persian army just walked right in and destroyed Babylon. So what can we learn from this story? And I've added chapters 4 and 5 because it wraps up the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his dreams. But what can we learn? This is a story of the providence of God who bestows kingdoms and takes them away. He raises up kings. He brings them down. Daniel is saying that the future of the people is not in the hands of the Babylonians. It's in the hands of God. The same thing is true for us. What happens in the world, what happens with this nation, is not in the hands of our government. It is not in the hands of the United Nations. It is not in the hands of anybody else but God. Number two, even for the individual believer, God is in charge and we are to remain faithful to Him no matter what. Number three, even if the entire world goes away from God, we are to stand firm. Number four, even if it feels like God has abandoned or forsaken us, as it must have felt sometimes to Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego in the Psalm 137 that I read, how can we sing these songs? Even if it feels like God has forsaken us, we must remain true to Him and believe that He is faithful and that He is true and that He will deliver us. Number five, we can trust God for our present and our future because He has been faithful in our past. We can trust God in our present and our future because He has proven Himself to be trustworthy. And that type of assurance allows us to say, it is well with my soul. Is it well with your soul today? It can be if you trust in God. If you trust in the God of gods, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, and never swerve. Don't make it lip service. Bow down to Him. Humble yourself before Him. Repent of sins. Obey Him. Be obedient to Him in faithfulness. And He will lift you up. And He will rescue you no matter what. God bless you.